On occasion, English author, physician, director, Renaissance man, wicked mimic Sir Jonathan Miller states he is done with opera. So far, he has not carried out that threat. He is still hooked on Shakespeare, Lear, Verdi, and the singers and actors who bring magic to the live stage. He started his career in theater with Dudley Moore, Alan Bennett, and Peter Cook in a satirical revue called Beyond the Fringe. His passion for science and the arts got him knighted, but he prefers to be called Doctor, not Sir. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jonathan Miller to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Hello.
Do you feel more like a doctor than a Sir?
No, well, I don't any longer feel like a doctor because I haven't had my hands on a patient's belly or chest for a very long time. My interests in neurology remain as strong as they were when I first went into medicine in order to do neurology. And it's a skill which is transferable to the theatre.
Transferable how?
Well, you just have to spend your time watching the minute details of human behavior in order to be a good diagnostician. And that's all that being a director is. It's being a good diagnostician or reminding your performers of the minute details of behavior in order to stop them doing these wild Pilate movements that pass for opera in traditional productions.
I think you've called it a Jurassic Park acting in the past.
There are Jurassic Park singers still. There are fewer of them than there used to be, but they always had sort of fatuous ideas about who they were being, and they would say, "No, Jonathan, I don't think Alfredo would do that." And you said, "Well, when did you last talk to Alfredo on the subject? And don't you realize he's a fictional character that doesn't exist? We bring him into existence in the course of the production."
And would these particular people be opera stars we know or knew, Pavarotti, Cecilia Bartoli?
Yes, some of them are.
Domingo.
I mean, yes, there are people who would be well known now, and they are quite difficult to work with because they do it all over the world and they come as late as they possibly can and assume that they know who Alfredo or whoever it is they're playing is, and they want to just say, "Tell me where I come on and tell me where I go off, and I will take care of the rest."
As a director, when you're directing someone like that, how do you help the singer connect to his inner self or her inner self to bring out the actor and the opera singer? Make the magic.
Well, what you try to do is not to be in a production which has those Jurassic Park performers. If I know in advance that they're going to be in the production, I ask not to direct it. I've only once or twice had to work with people like that. Most of the time you work with extremely cooperative, extremely convivial, companionable people who like being reminded of what they knew anyway and had forgotten.
Was it your mother, the great fiction writer, who said something like, "It's very important to make the negligible considerable in good fiction"?
Yes. This is,
What does that mean?
Well, it's just that most of the things which are recognizable in our life, in our actions and our performance, consist of negligible details, and our behavior is nothing more than the sum of all these negligible details, which if you leave them out, you don't get the texture of a human presence. So that you have to pay attention to these small details, what it is that people do while they're talking, that they will often be playing with the edge of their jacket or twiddling their ear while they're talking. Or I remember seeing some girls talking to one another on the subway, and one of them was just turning her hair around her index finger while she talked. Well, that's the sort of thing that you have to remind singers about.
And of course, our mothers always said to us, "Stop twirling your hair."
Yes. Well, because there's the idea that it's not elegant, but it's natural. And there are, of course, hand movements. I've just made one now. But they're very small, the hand movements we make. And there's a very large, interesting literature on the hand movements that accompany speech.
Who on the stage was a natural at figuring that out? A Sir Laurence Olivier, a Christopher Plummer?
Well, Chris Plummer was certainly very natural. The second time, I worked with him many years ago, first of all, on Danton's death. But when I went to Stratford, Ontario, to do King Lear, we talked a lot about these little gestures, and he did them quite naturally. Often it's a question of just reminding them. He's such a wonderfully naturalistic actor that you hardly have to remind him at all. Every now and then you say, wouldn't it be a good idea if while you're talking you just were playing with your finger on the top of the table?
And that little movement makes it real.
Well, it's part of it isn't that single movement. It's the idea that there are lots of these movements, and these very small movements of the hand that accompany speech. You see, here I'm saying the small movements of the hand that accompany speech. Once people start doing that, it looks as if they're drowning.
And as you know, so many politicians today, so many people are spun. There's somebody in the back saying, now when you make a point, do this. And if it's not a natural thing for the politician to do, everybody in the audience is thinking, that's not the truth.
No, it's if you ever have to tell people what to do when they're talking, it would. Imagine going out into the street and having a conversation with someone and saying, "Let's go back to the start of this conversation, and redo your hand movements."
Let's see if we can fix you up.
Yes, I mean it's completely unnecessary. There is, as I said, a very extensive and interesting literature on the hand movements that accompany speech. And they've been classified now, and we know exactly what people do. Well, they're all different, but nevertheless they fall into a set of classes of movement.
How does the mimic in you help you do what you do? Because you were one of the funniest.
Well, I was a funny guy on the
satirist.
stage a long time ago. I suppose whatever comic sense I had when I was working on the stage doing Beyond the Fringe, to some extent was transferable to the work that I do when I talk to people about their acting. But most of the time it's doing what my mother drew my attention to, which is just keeping your eye open and watching what people actually do. I mean, you see, almost all the interesting plays are really about totally forgettable people. I mean, Chekhov, for example, most of these characters, as they say themselves in Three Sisters, 5 years after their death, they'll be forgotten.
Oh, or the Cherry Orchard?
Or the Cherry Orchard. They just are forgettable people who are made memorable by the artwork.
La Traviata, which is the opera you're here to do, a love story. The soprano always dies in the end.
Yes, but she dies in my particular production without running round the stage halfway through and doing a lap of honor. I mean, I've seen productions in which she gets out of bed and runs around the room. Well, as I always remind the diva who's playing the part, or the actress, the singer, I said, dying is a full-time business and you stay in bed to do it, and the chances are that you'll be incontinent, and I don't want you whittling all over the floor. Thank you very much.
That's the doctor in you.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Well, I've seen people dying, and I know what people do. And in the interesting operas where people die, La Bohème, for example, for the moment, no one in the room sees her die. It's only the orchestra that tells you. There's a sighing sound, and it's only about 30 seconds later that someone walks past her bed and says, she's gone.
She's gone. And that beautiful score, Puccini's beautiful score, La Bohème, adds to it, but you're right. If you're going to die, you have to die right.
Yes, you've got to die right. And it's very interesting how often the dying person is impatient with the attentive sort of movements of the loved one, and they will often say, "Yes, no, please don't do that. I'm busy. I'm dying. But please, I know you mean well, but." And suddenly, scarcely noticing, they're not there, and that's it.
And it's nice if somebody dies in your arms.
Well,
for us,
it is,
or maybe it's
in some
not.
sense, but it may be nice. But there are so many cases in which I've seen, being in the ward, when relatives or loved ones, as they're so often called, are been there for 6 hours and they're standing side by side looking out of the window because time has passed, and what do you do? And they turn round and the patient is dead.
Or you go for dinner. I don't know what that's about. You go for dinner and think, we'll come back,
Yes,
right after
that's right.
dinner. And the minute, not the minute, but right after, my mother did that. And we wondered if we should feel guilty about it, or
No.
would she be happy we'd
No,
gone to dinner, we're having fine wine, and
It's just that
she went off.
dying, like many of the things that we do, often happens without drama. I mean, there are obviously moments of high drama and shrieking and desperation and loud grieving on the part of the dying as well. But so often, the most noticeable thing, I think, is when you do it with extraordinary reticence, and then it's rather interesting.
Reluctance. Your cultural odyssey began because your neighbor called you and asked you to direct an opera, or what happened?
Well, this was Roger Norrington. I'd never even seen an opera before, and Norrington, who has become since a very great conductor, he lived near me in North London, and he called me and said, "Would you like to come and direct an opera for this group called the Kent Opera?" And I said, "Well, I've never directed an opera, and I've never even seen one, and I can't read music." And he assured me that he could, and then said, well, I think you might be able to do it since I've seen you direct plays. And it's not that different. And
It's not.
I discovered that it isn't that different. I mean, people overestimate the distinction between talking and singing. And talking, in fact, is itself a form of singing. It has prosody, it has intonations and so forth, different from singing, but nevertheless, they are related to one another.
What was your first opera?
Così fan tutte.
Oh, the kind of it's a comedy, really.
Well, it's
or
a com-
is it?
well,
You'll tell me something different.
I think it is a comedy with a strange sort of tragedy built into it. I mean, people think of it as a comedy about infidelity, and actually it's a much more interesting drama about identity, about the risks of going into disguise and discovering that the anonymity which your disguise gives you allows you to bring out aspects of your own personality which you would otherwise be ashamed of.
Or testing somebody's fidelity
That's
in a
right.
very tricky way.
But you're testing your own fidelity. That's why people have masked balls, is that people who believe themselves to be masked can actually do things which they'd be ashamed to do if they were recognizable.
It happens at Halloween.
Yes, of course it does. And that's exactly what Così is about. The boys actually turn out to be discoverers of aspects of their own personality which they wouldn't have suspected. And actually, they show their own infidelity and aspects of their own character which they wouldn't have suspected when they were recognizable. That, again, I was inspired by a book that my mother wrote. She wrote a book just after the war. She was struck by the fact that my father's colleagues, my father was a doctor, who behaved with propriety when they were in civilian clothes, got into army costume, and so, because they thought they were no longer recognizable, began to misbehave themselves in all sorts of ways.
Do you help somebody become a better soldier by putting them in uniform, do you think? Or
No,
you
I think
said
what
your
happened-
father probably acted out more in the bar or something because he
Well,
was in uniform, or
I think my
don't
father
get the
didn't.
point.
My father, I don't think, did misbehave himself. Well, he may have done, but I never found out. But I do think that what happens is that, as the man I much admire, Irving Goffman, pointed out, performances are determined. What one does are very largely determined by what you believe yourself to be in the frame of. And if you're in the frame of being military, aspects of yourself become more apparent than they would have done if you believed yourself to be in the frame of simply being a consultant physician.
And we on the other side, for instance, if you go through a border and somebody's in a customs uniform, there's something about me that thinks, I've done something wrong, and I haven't.
That's what do you say?
Right?
But there's the whole question of uniforms, which confer upon the wearer a special sort of authority, which he or she would not have if, in fact, they were not wearing that uniform.
Exactly. Welcome back, and we will talk about La Traviata. Dr. Jonathan Miller, our guest.